Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 28th of October, almost to the end of the month now, and certainly feeling like winter in more and more places around Alaska. In the meantime, you can always check out the weather information through the day on your phone or on your computer at weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. It takes you to the same place. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391, or find us on NOAA Weather Radio or your marine radio there. The National Weather Service in Alaska is also on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. By the afternoon, of course, you know that I'm going to pitch our afternoon forecast on the 4 o'clock hour or so. You'll find it on NWS Anchorage and NWS Fairbanks. A quick brief of what's going on all the way around Alaska. And then after this show on alaskapublic.org or on the YouTube channel AKwx TV, you can find this complete broadcast there. Been some windy weather over the northern panhandle in the last 24 hours. This out of our friends down in the Juneau forecast office. They said 65 knot gusts were reached around 7 o'clock this morning around Eldred Rock. Some of the highest winds they've seen just today. Those winds coming out of the north there down the Lynn Canal and pretty close to Juneau, in some cases around the Juneau dock. We saw 70-mile-an-hour gusts there. That was around 3 o'clock this morning, so if the windows were rattling a little bit, that was probably why. Also, the South Douglas Boat Harbor was seeing 51-knot gusts, or pretty close to 60 miles an hour, in the middle of the night. Point Retreat and Little Island also saw gusts around the 50 to even 65-knot range there. Those were a little bit closer to dawn. The windy weather should gradually subside, though, as the storm system is working its way northward. You will start to get a little more rain up that way in the next 24 to 36 hours. In the meantime, Chukchi Seacoast is looking at heavy freezing spray. Gales and small crafts will continue for the Bering Sea, and if you're along the Alaska Peninsula, expect some gales there as well. Windy conditions will continue for southeast, but overall that stronger wind, especially in the north, should begin to subside. Here's a look at the Bering Sea and the North Pacific now. You can see several areas of low pressure. One of those working its way up just to the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula, dragging in more Pacific moisture and starting to push the current weather system across the west coast a little bit out of the way. As the clouds and the moisture fill in a little bit more, you'll start to see a better chance for rainfall across the central and western chain. Already that triple point where the cold and the warm and the mixing is occurring is traveling eastward along the chain, and we can probably expect some mild turbulence with that. Probably nothing too much to write home about, but a better chance of rain with that. Gales will continue across the Bering Sea, especially across the central and eastern chain. Yesterday we were talking about seeing some pretty strong gusts, and I think we had a few, but more often than not as we go to the next 24 hours, those winds should be subsiding even more, and in fact becoming southerly as the next storm system is working its way eastward. For the Alaska Peninsula, the gap winds will continue there. It looks like some very small focused gusts through those channeled terrain regions that you're pretty used to there if you live in the windy spots. That will be an issue for the next 24 hours, but that too should be improving as we go into your Wednesday and Thursday. Across the rest of Alaska, you can see the storm system working its way northward. As it was working north, it is simply moving that vacuum farther and farther northward, closer to the Lynn Canal, and helping to draw that air right through that very channeled terrain there, through the inner passageways there. So as a result, the winds were pretty gusty coming right through the Lynn Canal earlier this morning. Again, as that gets closer, the wind should subside because that difference won't be quite as great. Low pressure across the western Gulf, also dragging in northerly flow across the west coast. That's keeping pockets of snow showers falling all the way from the Chukchi Sea all the way down to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. We're seeing a better chance for rainfall across the Alaska Peninsula, but we did see some snow falling there, reported in the observation at Unalaska. Observations around Golcana today, though, seem to indicate a little bit more of a freezing fog or perhaps some light flurries there. It looked like a pretty stable situation, and again, maybe a little bit of a poor visibility there from time to time, or maybe just a little bit of ice crystals on the sensor. Across the Chukchi Seacoast and the Beaufort Seacoast, a little bit of a change in the weather for the last couple days means the ice is probably filling in a little bit faster in your area. A cold front sweeping across the north coast will continue working its way eastward quickly tonight. Snow showers will continue to pop up across the west coast, and watch for some pockets of rainfall with low pressure just south of Kodiak Island at 990 millibars. The low in southeast is at 989 millibars. That too is working its way northward. We're going to watch for this entire system to kind of focus in on itself and merge into one storm. And we also have another storm that's coming in its way from the west. As that works its way eastward, first we'll see warmer air moving across the Aleutians, and then it'll be followed by a little bit more of a westerly flow as we get into tonight and tomorrow. Looking at tonight across the Gulf, low pressure is already absorbing that southeastern low. At 991 millibars, you can see the low working its way northward, probably brushing places like Seward and Kodiak Island with a little bit of light precipitation that may mix closer to Kodiak Island and across Bristol Bay. Across the Alaska Peninsula, a better chance for some of that to be rain and snow showers, or a mix going back and forth from time to time. Westerlies coming into looks like Attu and Shemya will continue working its way eastward toward Kiska, squeezing out some rainfall, but notice that it's putting you back in those southerly winds with a ridge of high pressure extending right through the central chain and probably just west of the Pribilofs. You'll see your winds come around as we get into tomorrow and into Thursday. Across the north slope, frontal boundary working its way across the coastal plain will likely inspire some more snow showers there. Plenty of dry air, though, across the interior, so if you get stuck under some low clouds, again, don't be surprised to see a flurry or two maybe around Golconda, but more often than not, you'll be dealing with more clouds than anything else, certainly precipitation related. By Wednesday, as the front swings eastward, it might ring out some snow showers close to the Alcan border. The main focus for any unsettled weather, though, will remain across the Gulf, with low pressure trying to organize itself once again and wrapping in on itself. As that works its way closer to the coast, you'll see a better chance for rain around Prince William Sound and Kodiak Island and parts of southeast. That wind gradient, or the pressure gradient, should not be as tight as it has been earlier this morning, so the wind should not be as much of a problem as they have been today. But still, with the front in the area, you'll want to watch for some turbulence if you're flying. The front moving across the Bering will continue working its way eastward. We still have our ridge of high pressure here from St. Lawrence Island to Nunivak Island in the Alaska Peninsula. And as a result, it won't just swing into the west coast, and you'll see a little bit more of a west and southwesterly shift for places like Unalaska, Nikolsky, and out across the Aleutians through Adak and Atka. And the west coast still dealing with some spotty snow showers throughout your Wednesday. By Thursday, that seems to wind down a little bit more as we develop more of an offshore flow. Winds around low pressure across the central and southern Bering at 968 millibars start to crank up a little bit more. We'll watch for those winds to pick up, mainly on the south and western side. Right now, some of the windier spots would probably be closer to Unalaska and Nikolsky. As we get across the east part of the Gulf of Alaska, low pressure continues to sit in that region at 976 millibars. The front is now over land, and with that, places north of Juneau, and probably dealing with a little bit of an opportunity for some snow showers. We'll have to see how that shapes up, as that front will really help determine exactly what's going on in its exact position. 24 hours out from now, it could change just a little bit. Across the Yukon Valley, a frontal boundary lingers there after colder air drops southward. That'll keep the north and easterly winds focused for places like Kaktovik and Prudhoe Bay, and offshore winds blowing through Kotzebue and the Seward Peninsula. Here's a look at current temps today, and you'll notice most areas in southeast were back in the mid to upper 40s, especially the further south you go, down toward Haida Gwaii. Highs were in the lower 50s today. Prince William Sound was in the 30s and 40s, including areas like Kenai at 34, Anchorage 31, Seward and Homer both in the lower 40s. Glen Allen was only 10 today, 28 around Talkeetna, 21 for Fairbanks, 16 in Denali, and 29 in Eagle. Further north, it was only 7 in Fort Yukon this afternoon, 16 in Anaktuvuk Pass. Ambler and Bettles were both in the low to mid-20s. The Arctic coast, a little bit different story from east to west. In the Beaufort Seacoast, it was in the teens. The Chukchi Seacoast in the 20s to about 30 degrees around Point Hope. Teens and 20s for the northern half of the Kotzebue Sound, lower 30s all the way around the Horn through the Seward Peninsula, and 32 at Nome, 34 in Unalakleet. Bethel was showing 38 with Hooper Bay at 33. Around Lake Iliamna, temperatures were in the upper 30s and low 40s today. Bristol Bay also about the same, anywhere from 39 to about 45 degrees. The Alaska Peninsula just shy of 40 for most places, and the central and western chain saw temps ranging from about 48 in the west to about 39 in Atka, with the Pribilofs holding at or just below 40. Overnight low temperatures will drop into the single digits. Out to the west, you'll notice most areas hover in the teens and 20s, including the Yukon-Kuskokwim coast. Kodiak 38, southeast, upper 30s to lower 40s with the central and western chain in the upper 30s to as warm as 45 in Attu. 15 in Barrow tonight. Shishmaref looking at about 18 degrees with 12 in Kivalina and a high of 21 there tomorrow. 16 in Fairbanks. Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse in the lower 20s. South Central is expected to see highs in the mid to upper 30s tomorrow. 45 in Kodiak. The chain expecting highs in the mid to upper 40s. Southeast a little bit milder, especially south of Sitka to Craig and Klawock and Ketchikan. Look for high temperatures there to close in on 50 degrees. Flying weather includes patchy MVFR across the Arctic coast, and you can see some of that really breaking up as that offshore flow starts to develop later in the afternoon. You'll see MVFR west of the Bering Strait and IFR conditions from Kiska all the way out to about Nikolsky, with MVFR conditions on the Bering Sea coast side of the Alaska Peninsula and IFR expected across northern areas in southeast and right there from Yakutat all the way down toward the Dixon entrance, but mainly along the coast. Past conditions include VFR and Anaktuvik, but heading north you may find some of that MVFR. The same goes for Adigan Pass tomorrow. Most of the pass should be VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, as well as Rainy Pass and certainly Windy Pass. And let's keep going. Isabel Pass, Mentasta Pass, you guessed it, Tanita Pass, and Portage Pass, all expected to be VFR through your Wednesday. So at least clear sailing, if not a little bit of smooth sailing. Chilkoot and White Pass, we do expect to transition to some lowered visibility and ceilings as we get into the afternoon. So if you're flying there, keep an eye on that. Some warmer air located out across the northern part of the Yukon and western provinces across the Gulf of Alaska. You can see that warmer air working its way northward with that coastal storm dragging that forward. The surface freezing line snaking over the Alaska Peninsula continues to drop a little bit further south. And then you see the warm air making an intrusion across the western Bering, thanks to the storm system working in and through the Aleutians at this hour. Icing potentials below 6,000 feet out across places like Kaktovik and mainly the far eastern coastal plain. We do have some light risk for icing across southeast and across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, parts of Bristol Bay, and way high up there across the central chain, generally above 10,000 feet as that warmer air is coming in and changing that situation. The jet stream shows a ridge of high pressure across the northern Pacific. That's allowing low pressure to focus on the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is the storm we started looking at in satellite picture first off. Low pressure is also dropping southward across the coastal plain, and you can see those winds coming in around 80 knots or so, mainly from west to east, but the trough is allowing colder air to fall southward. Across the Gulf of Alaska, low pressure is sending a southerly flow into the northern and eastern Gulf Coast, and much stronger winds are south of that storm, around 100 to as high as 110 knots coming into the lower 48. At 9,000 feet, a broad westerly flow is coming across the Chukchi seacoast between 10 and 25 knots, and you can see the ridge of high pressure shaping the weather across the Bering and the North Pacific. Wind speeds at their highest are around 40 to 50 knots, generally north of the Aleutians, and then low pressure across the Gulf, dragging in northerly flow out into the open water, helping keep the situation pretty dry for South Central. Wind speeds there as high as 40 knots, with southeasterlies coming in parallel to the southeastern coast, anywhere from 25 to 35 knots. Similar conditions there at 3,000 feet. Winds are a little bit stronger and up to 40 knots there. Northerlies are coming down the west coast, 10 to 20 knots, with a return flow coming in from the south across the interior at about 10 knots. Some stronger winds just offshore of the north coast, around 35 knots or so from the west. And our ridge once again affecting the winds across areas north of the Aleutians, 30 to 40 knots, generally right over the Pribilofs, in fact. And high pressure slowing the winds around the Bering Strait communities with an easterly flow over St. Matthew at 25 knots. So turbulence, we'll watch for some bumps there around southeast, generally below 4,000 feet. The same goes for the YK Delta and the Alaska Peninsula. Probably have a stronger area of turbulence generally west of the Pribilofs and north of Adak and Atka. So don't see that over land just yet, but occasional moderate there west of the Pribilofs if you have any need to go in that direction. Otherwise light to isolated moderate across the far western chain and the central chain, as well as the Alaska Peninsula, especially on the Pacific side due to that gap or channeled flow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather. Growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region. The rain-snow line, all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense in what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. There are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas. We have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. One of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors. big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. And part of being weather ready is the Alaska Weather Show, so we're pleased that you're joining us here today and anytime. Today's Sea Ice Edge is always found online at weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php, and you can see with the changing weather that there's a little more ice across the Beaufort Sea, and it's certainly increasing across the Chukchi Seacoast as well. Around Kotzebue Sound and in Norton Sound, a little more ice developing there right along the coastal areas. And again, we're expecting that most of these the coastal areas here are actually looking at shorefast ice, with some of the open areas filling in fairly quickly just offshore. So anytime that you want to track that, you can head to the webpage that you see there and also find more high-resolution satellite imagery there from time to time. Here's a look at southeast now, and winds will be subsiding across the northern Lynn Canal. Not expecting those tremendous gusts like we were last night. A northerly flow at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Southeasterly still a little bit strong across the Clarence Strait at 30 knots with 4 to 6-foot seas there. Coastal winds coming in from the south and southeast up to 25 knots. Most areas looking at 7 to 9-foot seas. More of an easterly flow out of Yakutat, becoming northerly by Thursday. Westerlies coming in to Sitka and Craig and the Dixon entrance at 25 knots with 13 to 14-foot seas. And southeasterlies pick up once again as we head into Thursday across the Clarence Strait, and northerlies develop at a little stronger note there from the Lynn Canal all the way down through Petersburg at 30 knots with 6-foot seas inside the inside passages there. Across south central, north and easterly winds coming down the Cook Inlet and over Prince William Sound at 10 to 15 knots. Northwesterlies west of the Barrens will come in around 20 knots with northerlies inside of Shelikof Strait. Some of the stronger winds will be just east of Kodiak Island at 35 knots with a 9-foot sea there, and you can see northeasterlies east of the Barrens becoming westerly by Thursday. Northerlies inside of Prince William Sound pick up a little bit more, and you can see 5 to 6-foot seas in the western Gulf with 2 to 3-foot seas in the Cook Inlet at 10 to 15 knots from the north, with westerlies continuing just west of the Barrens here at 30 knots. Across the Alaska Peninsula, northwesterlies will continue through the daytime tomorrow. Still looking at some isolated areas of higher gusts there outside of those gap wind areas. I do expect winds there as high as 45 to even 50 knots in some cases, perhaps briefly worse. 35 to 40 knots sustained though, 13 to 15-foot seas and 10 to 13-foot seas on the Bering side. As we get into Thursday, the winds start to shift around a little bit more as the high pressure ridge is working its way eastward. You get more into a southerly flow across Sand Point and King Cove. Easterlies north of Cold Bay and along the Bering Sea coast, and light northerly winds inside of Bristol Bay. One word of caution here, I messed up and saved the wrong map. So this is a look at yesterday's map. So with that said, let's just scratch this off. This was today and not happening tomorrow, and wind should be subsiding. We'll get into some light southerly flow tomorrow for Wednesday. And then once we get into Thursday, you'll see that shift continuing a little bit more through central and southwesterly flow. 20 to 35 knots on the Bering side, and stronger winds, especially south of Adak and Atka at 45 knots, 16 to 21 foot seas there. With 35 to 45 knot winds developing on Thursday as that frontal boundary is working its way eastward. Across the west, you can already see the winds shifting to more of a northwesterly flow for Kiska and southwesterlies around Kiska and points east, 40 knots there with an 18-foot sea. So again, this is Thursday, and we'll try and get the right maps to you tomorrow. On Wednesday, for the west coast, a north and northwesterly flow coming down from Amonach to Hooper Bay to the Kuskokwim Bay, 25 to 30 knots or so. Northerlies around the Pribilofs with a 9-foot sea, northwesterlies around St. Matthew, looking at 7-foot seas there. By Thursday, the winds shift course, and again, we're looking at that offshore flow developing. You'll remember that from the surface charts, and we'll see those again in a minute. Southeasterlies coming out of the Pribilofs at 30 knots with an 8-foot sea, and northeasterlies over the Kuskokwim area at 4-foot seas are expected with a 15-knot wind. Well, how about that? There's the Aleutian map. I didn't see that coming. Look at a south and southwesterly flow. This would be for tomorrow there. There's the chart that I obviously didn't forget. Just put it in the wrong spot. Okay. It's not April Fool's either. A southerly flow across the west with a 12-foot sea, and northwesterlies across Unalaska, 25 to 35 knots. See, I'm taking care of you there. Let's see what happens here. Here's Thursday across the north coast. That's what happened. A westerly flow north of Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik, 15 to 20 knots. Winds will stay pretty light around the Chukchi seacoast for Wednesday, and north and northeasterly winds coming down from Barrow all the way down toward Cape Lisburne, and northeasterlies inside of Kotzebue Sound. Let's do a quick check and recap of tonight's weather. This is certainly tonight. Low pressure in the Gulf, sweeping the winds up to the north and east through southeastern Alaska. And a weak front moving across the coastal plain keeps snow showers going there. Winds coming up across the central chain, and more snow across the west coast, though light and showery. More to come in southeast. Have a good night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.